just check real quick to make sure that we are a go for our people at home.
Well, we try to, the space shuttle.
All right. I'm not seeing it yet, Brandy, is it?
It says it's live.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So we are live. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I'm Amy Burnett, and this morning we are going to be talking about the book of forgiveness, the fourfold path for healing ourselves and our world. But before we get started, let's start our morning with a moment of prayer and affirmation. I claim for myself the joy and ability to express even greater love by allowing forgiveness in my life. I recognize in doing so that I open my experience to more goodness and divine circulation. I accept myself for who I really am, the embodiment of the divine in this very moment. I am compassionate with myself and others. I know that, like me, everyone I encounter is also on an ever-evolving path to be an expression of God. There is no one path to forgiveness and no predetermined speed to get there. I am gentle with myself and others as I allow forgiveness into my relationships and my daily practice. As I heal myself and my relationships, I contribute to the healing of the world. Amen. All right, so like I said, this morning's topic is the Book of Forgiving, and this is by Desmond and Mpho Tutu. Desmond Tutu recently passed and has a long history of putting just wonderful information out into the world. He's had so many experiences that really just are unimaginable to most of us. He experienced apartheid and, all kinds of atrocities that went along with that. He's also helped others get through really tough situations. And so this book is kind of littered with stories as they go through different paths and things of people who have experienced things and have been brought to some form of forgiveness with that. And I'm not going to tell the stories today just because for sake of time in this space, I wanted to get to kind of his ideas around forgiveness and the fourfold path. So the fourfold path, as outlined in the book, is first, telling the story; second, naming the hurt; third, granting forgiveness; and fourth, renewing or releasing the relationship. And so first he starts out with an understanding of what forgiveness is not. So he says, forgiveness is not weak, it is not passive, and it's not for the faint of heart. It is not an effortless act for any of us, and it doesn't serve anyone to minimize the complexity involved in the work of forgiving. That it doesn't happen to the exclusion of other emotions, and also that it does not subvert justice. So some people think that, or they've made statements that in forgiving, you're denying justice because you're letting people off the hook. And what he says is the truth is that people will always live with the consequences of their actions, whether you forgive them or not. So there's always some consequence going on there. And so for some of the people in the stories in the book, that is that they had to serve prison sentences, or they were found guilty of other crimes, things like that. But there can still be forgiveness in those moments. Because he says forgiving doesn't mean that we forget the harm. It doesn't mean that we're denying the harm. It doesn't mean we're pretending that it didn't happen or that whatever happened wasn't as bad as it really was. It's just the opposite. The cycle of forgiveness is activated and completed only within absolute truth and honesty. So why should we cultivate forgiveness? So he says that retaliation gives at best a momentary respite from our pain. So most of us have probably experienced that at some point in our lives where we retaliated against someone who had harmed us, And it might feel good for like a moment, but then we have to sit with the fact that we then were a person that was creating harm for someone else. And it doesn't really give us the healing and the peace that we were looking for. It gives us like a momentary like, ha, I gotcha. But then we're still left with all of the hurt and all of the feelings that were created in the moment of harm. He says, without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who harmed us. We're bound by the chains of bitterness, tied together with them, and trapped. Until we can forgive the person who harmed us, that person holds the keys to our happiness. Well, that's not what any of us want, right? We don't want our happiness tied to the person who hurt us. Yeah, so that's what he says, is when we forgive, we take back control of our own fate and our feelings. And we become our own liberators. We don't forgive to help the other person. We don't forgive for others. We really are forgiving for ourselves. It's finding inner peace in that forgiveness is what we're looking for. So he says, really, forgiveness is the best form of self-interest. It's the best thing you can do for yourself, both spiritually and scientifically. So then he talks about some health benefits of forgiving. And this is interesting. I always like to see where these topics, where kind of spirituality and science intersect, and we can see some actual data on what improving some of these practices might bring into our lives. So he says that forgiveness has been shown to reduce depression, increase hopefulness, decrease anger, improve spiritual connection, and increase emotional confidence. And there has been research done that shows that people who are more forgiving report fewer health and mental problems and fewer physical symptoms of stress. It's also shown that failure to forgive may be a risk factor for heart disease, high blood pressure, and a score of other chronic stress-related illnesses. Medical and psychological studies have shown that a person holding on to anger and resentment is at an increased risk for anxiety, depression, and insomnia. They're more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, ulcers, migraines, backaches, heart attacks. And so the reality is that we are built to be and are interconnected as humans. And we're healthier and happier in our humanness when we experience strong social connections and feel like we're part of our shared community. Holding on to anger and resentment and experiencing those health issues mentioned often leads to feelings of social isolation. And I know that I've experienced that before. The more you're kind of inside your own head and dealing with all kinds of anxiety or stress or depression or all of those things, the less and less you feel connected to those around you and maybe start to isolate yourself more and more. So there was a study done at Harvard School of Public Health that studied 7,000 men and women. And according to their findings, people who were socially isolated were 3 times more likely to die prematurely than those who had a strong social web. Even more astonishing to the researchers was that those who had a strong social circle and unhealthy lifestyle, such as smoking, obesity, lack of exercise, actually lived longer than those who had a weak circle but a healthy lifestyle. So that's interesting to think about. So in a separate journal article of Science, it concluded that loneliness was a greater risk factor for disease and death than smoking. So he says, in other words, loneliness will kill you faster than smoking cigarettes. Wow. And so that's kind of an interesting thing that, and how many people you may have experienced people in your life that didn't have a very, what people would deem as a healthy lifestyle, but boy, they were really connected with those around them, and they seemingly had less health problems or lived longer than others. And I know there's all sorts of anecdotal people who've lived to be 100, and someone asks, well, what is the key to living to 100? What advice do you have? And they'll say things like, drink a whiskey a day, smoke a cigarette, regular Dr. Pepper, not diet, and be with your family. Kind of like they say these kind of things. And everyone kind of chuckles and says, well, that can't be true, because we know that all of these other things are maybe not very healthy for you. But these studies would seem to point to the fact that the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is have friends and family and connections and stay engaged with other human beings. And that has really big health benefits that we don't always hear about or recognize. And I see Elby shaking her head, so she knows what I'm talking about here. We have those experiences, right? Or we have experiences with people who seemingly do everything right. They are eating right, they're exercising, but maybe they're very isolated. And
it's out of fear.
Yeah.
A
So.
lot of times. I got to do this because I don't.
Okay. It's a good perspective.
I guess I heard a lecture from a symposium one time that this girl could not eat anything. She couldn't go to the restaurant with her friends. She was like, all kinds of... And then she went to Europe. And she experienced the way they eat in Europe. And their apartments are really small, so they don't have friends over, so they meet in restaurants. And they spend a couple of hours. In the middle of the meal, they get out and go have a cigarette, and then they come back. But it's the ambience of the atmosphere, the camaraderie that makes your digestive system work. And if you believe that piece of chocolate cake and you're just enjoying it, it sends signals to your body to digest it, and it is good for you because your body knows how to receive in gratitude and in joy and ambiance.
Yeah. So I don't know if you could hear, she started that off by saying that sometimes when people are living those really restrictive, healthy lifestyles, that it's often coming from a fear. Like there's a fear of death, a fear of getting sick. And so they're working really hard to watch what they eat, make sure they exercise, live a clean life, do all of these things. But in doing so, they're isolating themselves. So like she was saying, so this person who wouldn't go out to eat at restaurants with friends because she wasn't preparing the food herself and was being more strict. So it's just an interesting thought to think that, and always in moderation is probably the key here, but you can be doing everything right, but if you're really isolated, you could still be prone to a lot of these health issues. So some other statements about forgiveness that he makes is that unconditional forgiveness is a different model of forgiveness than the gift with strings. So what he refers to as the gift with strings is that I'll forgive you if. So we're looking for something. I'll forgive you if you do this, if you make amends in exactly the way that I think you should. If you're acting exactly the way I think you should, then I'll be able to forgive you. And he says unconditional forgiveness is just a grace, and it's freely given. It's a choice we make, and the ability to forgive others comes from the recognition that we are all human. We're all in our humanness. Forgiveness can feel as if a weight has been lifted and you're free to let go of the past. Sorry, my pages are stuck together. And move forward in your life. It may not be found in a single act of grace or a simple string of words, but rather in a process of truth and reconciliation. And he says the invitation to forgive is really an invitation to find healing and peace for yourself, and to allow the other person to be on their journey of finding healing and peace. And Desmond says that in his native language, the words used to ask for forgiveness translate in English to, I ask you for peace, which I thought was really beautiful. So if forgiving is so good for us, why or how do we get stuck? So he says the response to hurt is universal. And each of us experience sadness, pain, anger, or shame, or a combination of all of those. And for most of us, our reactions are so habitual, we don't even realize that we have a choice between what he lines out as the revenge cycle and the forgiveness cycle. And so, you know, the revenge cycle is where we get caught in that wanting to see retribution, wanting to see a payback, and caught in the feeling of how that might feel good for the moment that we talked about. And so he said this often happens when the affront is so painful or so intolerable that we can't accept it. And instead of placing our hands on our hearts and really feeling those feelings and weeping for what we've lost, we start pointing our fingers at others. We need someone to blame. We need it to be somebody's fault. We want everyone to look at the person who harmed us and see what they've done. And we really get stuck in that need for revenge or retribution. And so instead of embracing our sadness, we just keep stoking our anger. And so when we do that, who are we really harming when we get stuck in that cycle? Ourselves, right? Because most of the time, the person who harmed us that we're so angry with and we're just thinking about it every day and getting stuck in that revenge cycle, they're not giving us a second thought. They're out living life, doing whatever they're doing, and they may not even be remembering, or they may not realize how deeply that moment impacted us. And so when we get stuck in that revenge cycle, that's what he said, we're just taking in poison for ourselves, and we're just letting that stew in our bodies. And that's why it talks about, you know, when we let those things stew in our bodies and hold on to that stress and anger, that's where we know some of those health issues come from, where anxiety and depression and high blood pressure and all of that is because we're holding stuff in, and we're sometimes doing that harm to ourselves. Like, we have the choice not to stay in that cycle. And so he says we're feeling compelled to restore our dignity by rejecting our pain and denying our grief. We're trying to suck it up, I'm fine, but we're really not, because we're having all these thoughts of anger and frustration. And he says in those moments, what we're also doing is rejecting our shared humanity and choosing to retaliate in some way, big or small, or wish some amount of payback or cruelty onto another person. And that's really from a place of us not being able to admit our own woundedness. And when we can't see that in ourselves, then we can't see the other person as a wounded person who has also harmed us out of his or her own ignorance, pain, or brokenness.
Broke people, hurt people.
Okay,
Yeah.
so her
So she's
comment
saying-
was broke people, hurt people,
Yeah.
broken people.
Hurt people.
Hurt people.
Yeah, we've heard that before. And so while that doesn't excuse what anyone has done, it allows us to have moments of compassion when we can truly see that in the other person, that they also had a path of hurt and woundedness maybe that led to them responding to us in the way they did, or doing whatever they did that hurt us so deeply. And again, doesn't mean we excuse, it doesn't mean we forget, but it does give us a different lens to look through, and that puts us in a path of forgiveness instead of holding on. Yeah.
I think what you just said about that doesn't excuse the action or welcome it in is really important, because I think sometimes people don't forgive because that they feel like that then they're approving of the action. No, you can forgive the human that caused the hurt without welcoming a repeat of that behavior. You can set a boundary and say, that's not acceptable. I can forgive you, I can love you as a fellow human, but I am setting a boundary that says this behavior is not welcome in my life.
Exactly. Yeah. He said this is usually where people bring up the idea of evil, or things that people who've done things that others deem kind of unforgivable. And so he says there's those who do monstrous or evil acts are not evil or monsters. And the reason he says that is that By labeling someone a monster, by labeling someone as evil, we deny that person's divine nature and their ability to change. And we also deny them the accountability for their actions. Because if we just label someone beyond redemption, then it's a pass for whatever behavior they're displaying, right? If you label me a monster or unforgivable, then where is the impetus for change or for transformation if that's just who I am? But if you say to me, you have done monstrous acts, or you have done things that would be defined as evil, and here at Unity we have different ideas of evil, but just those words are thrown out there a lot, then that acknowledges the person and the soul underneath that, and the openness that it could be transformed or changed into something different. So he says, I have found that hope and goodness can sometimes emerge from even the unlikeliest of packages. Forgiving does not condone an act. It does not relieve someone of responsibility for what they have done. It does not erase accountability. It is not about turning a blind eye or even turning the other cheek. It's not about letting someone off the hook or saying it was okay for them to do something monstrous. Forgiveness is simply about understanding that every one of us is both inherently good and inherently human. With every hopeless situation and every seemingly hopeless person lies the possibility of transformation. And so he then goes through the fourfold path. And so he acknowledges at one point in the text that this fourfold path is what he has seen work for people. He has seen many, many people go through the path of forgiveness. He himself has had to go through the path of forgiveness. Mpho Tutu is his daughter, and she has had several situations that she has gone through on the path of forgiveness. And so he says this is not like the textbook, like start at step one, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and everything will be fine. But it is a framework that he has seen be successful. And he feels that it would be a place to start if you're struggling with needing to forgive something and not really knowing where to begin that journey. So I just want to be clear on that. This isn't like, do this, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it is, like I said, a framework that might be helpful. So the first part of the fourfold path is telling the story. And he says telling the story is how we get our dignity back after we've been harmed. It's how we start to take back what was taken from us, and we begin to understand and make meaning out of our hurting. And so when we know our stories and make sense of what's happened, we get connected to the bigger story of our lives and its meaning. So it kind of gets us outside of this body and these thoughts and helps us feel that connection. And so he says that telling of the story, we have to tell the facts of the story. That's an important step. And then when you tell your story, it's like you're putting the pieces of the puzzle back together again. And he talks about, he says in the beginning, your memories and your facts, depending on what the trauma was, may be fragmented or hard to articulate, and that's okay. And there's several stories in there where people talk about when they were telling their story, maybe right after whatever happened, they're telling it. And then maybe 6 months down the road, they're telling that same story. And this actually happened with one of the stories his daughter had told him. That like 6 months down the road, she's telling the story and walking through the events, and she mentioned a whole new fact that she had never said before in the story. And when he asked her about that, she said, oh, I guess I hadn't remembered before that had happened that day. And so he says that's the importance of telling your story, is that trauma often clouds the facts of a story, and especially if whatever we're looking to forgive was a really traumatic event for us, it may be that our brain kind of blocks out some of the facts that surrounded that event. But over time, as we retell it, we unlock different parts of that memory. and it might help bring us to better understanding. And that's one of the stories that his daughter tells about a horrific incident that happened. Those facts that came later, those remembrances that came later, helped her make more sense of what had happened the day of the event. And it also helped her to recognize some moments within that day where she had been divinely guided to do something different and actually kept herself and her daughter safe. And so there was a lot of healing within that, to know that even in that moment of this horrific thing happening, she had been divinely guided to minimize some of the hurt and the danger that was there. And so there was she could find some peace in knowing that. So that's the importance of telling your story. It's not to tell your story to be a martyr or to get people on your side or any of that. It's really a process. He uses it as a process of healing. And he says, it can feel scary to tell your story, especially about something that was really hurtful for you, because you might risk being hurt again. You might risk that people won't believe you. You might risk that whoever is hearing your story won't affirm you within that story. But locking the stories inside us and denying their impact just compounds the initial hurt, like we were talking about before. The more we lock it inside, the more our body has to store all of that. And we have stress hormones, we have all of that going on, and it can really do us some damage. So he also discusses then the importance of choosing who you share your story with. And he says it's better for your healing if you begin the process with someone that you are 99% sure is going to be affirming, empathetic, and trustworthy. So you don't want to go tell your story of the most traumatic thing that ever happened to you to someone that you don't trust will at least hear you empathetically and affirm you. Because that could create another hurt on top of hurt if we're telling our stories to people that go, that didn't happen, or there's no way, or what did you do wrong that made the person do that? You have people that maybe are in your life or that you've just met that don't know you, that don't have an experience with you, that wouldn't understand how difficult it is for you to tell that story, or maybe all of the circumstances around it. So really pick wisely those people that you want to tell your full story to. And then he says it's also possible that we'll need to tell our stories multiple times and to many people before we're ready to move on in the forgiveness process. And that's the part of the telling the story being that part of healing. That we, in telling our stories, we're not only acknowledging the facts and the hurt associated, but we are coming to a form of acceptance. And I don't know about you guys, but the more you kind of tell that story, the more distance you get from it. Like as you work through, often the first time that someone has to tell a story of something that was really hurtful, maybe they're crying or they're shaking, like you're feeling all of that emotion again as if it was just happening all over again. But as you really come to terms with the facts and the feelings within that story, you can let those feelings flow through you. And so we've all probably experienced people, even like Desmond Tutu and Mpho and all these people that have had these horrific experiences, and then they go on a talk show and they tell their story and they're talking about truly awful things that maybe none of us could imagine experiencing, and they're not getting overly emotional, and they have this perspective on the situation that we're just blown away by. It's often because that's not the first time they've told that story. They've told the story and come to an acceptance of this is something that happened. This is something that I can not change. We can't go back and change the past unless any of you are hiding a time machine. And then if so, let's talk after. There's a few things I might like to go back and change. But So when we start to realize that it's a circumstance that happened, we don't have the power to go back and change it. But what we do have the power to do is not get stuck in the past forever. What we do have the power to do is decide how we're going to respond and how we're going to move forward. And that's when we start to take our internal power back and get on that path of forgiveness. And he says that we've reached acceptance when we no longer have thoughts that paying someone back or wishing them ill will somehow make us feel better or make things right. So when we can talk about that story, and we can talk about this hurt that was caused without thinking, and someday they're going to get theirs. When we truly just, I am a human that this happened to, this other human, maybe created this situation for me or was a part of this situation, because we always have a little bit of responsibility somewhere in there. And so he says, just as it's equally important to tell your story as it is to not get trapped in your story. And getting stuck here is where, we get stuck in the story of victimhood. If you get trapped in the story, and so in telling that story, you remain stuck in that place where you do wish ill on the person, or you're hoping that karma's going to get you someday, that kind of thing, then we're not allowing the healing within ourselves. So the second part of the path is naming the hurt. And he says that's where we start to break free from getting trapped in the story. So when we ignore pain, it just grows bigger and bigger, right? We know this. And he says it's like an abscess that is never drained, and eventually it just explodes. Like you can only hold it in for so long. And when that happens, it infiltrates every area of our lives, like our health, our family, our job, our relationship, our faith, our ability to feel joy. We may be just racked with resentment, anger, and hurts that are never named. And we read another book here at Unity, I believe it was in Untethered Soul, and they talked about having a thorn. Like that these hurts that we don't address is like having a thorn in your arm. And it starts to hurt, and you go, oh, and you put a little something on it, and then you just keep wrapping it and bandaging it. Like, oh, when I hit it, it hurts, and I don't want to think about it, and I don't want to deal with the pain of that. So we just keep like putting padding over it, and then we're not using that arm because it hurts to use that arm, and we just keep putting all of these things in place so that we don't have to feel the pain of the thorn. And then eventually, like, we can't do that forever, right? Like something's going to happen. So we bump against something and it brings it all out. And he agrees that the only way to truly relieve that pain is to, he says, like, dig it out by the root. So you've got to get to the root of what you were feeling, and allow all of those feelings to release before we can be rid of the thorn or be rid of this, what did he call it, an abscess. And he says when we give voice to our hurt, it loses its stranglehold on our lives and our identities and stops being the central character in our story. So it's also, looking at the imagery of that thorn, and we've got this big bandage wrapped around our arm and we're holding it very gently. Well, what does everyone see when they first meet us? They go, oh gosh, what's wrong with your arm? What'd you do? How did you hurt yourself, right? And then we're stuck in that story of how did we get this thorn in our arm? And it just goes on and on. Whereas if we dealt with it and got rid of it, a day later, a week later, a month later, no one would ever know we had a thorn in our arm. And instead of asking that question as we meet, they would, hi, how are you? And we would talk about other things. He also encourages us to remember that no feeling is wrong, bad, or invalid. Like, you feel what you feel, and you are allowed to feel exactly how you feel. It's not wrong, it's not bad, it's not invalid. That we may be experiencing stages of grief within some of these hurts and this path of forgiveness, and that we have to honor that And wherever we are in that process, we just have to acknowledge that we're in the process and allow it to move forward. So again, he says, make sure you find someone who will acknowledge you and listen to your feelings without trying to fix them. So that's the other part. We all probably have people, or we may be the person that when someone's telling us something, our brain immediately starts going, well, if you would just do this, this, and this, everything would be better. But when we're dealing with grief and pain and trying to find forgiveness, it's better if we have someone that will just hear us and not judge us and allow us to feel however we're feeling, without trying to give us steps to fix it and then being frustrated because we're not following those steps. The third step on the path is granting forgiveness. So after telling our stories and naming our hurts, then we move on to being able to grant forgiveness. And he says, depending on the situation or how long we've been carrying it, that might go quickly or it might move at a snail's pace, and that's okay. Again, there's no predetermined length of time that it takes to forgive someone, and depending on the level of pain and hurt, it may take us longer. But as long as we're not staying stuck in the story of victimhood and at least making some attempts to allow those feelings and address what's going on, then we're moving at the exact right pace at the exact right time. We're able to forgive when we're able to connect to our shared community, to recognize that we're all vulnerable human beings capable of thoughtlessness and cruelty. And so he says here, this was an interesting thing too. He said, I must caution that many people, even very spiritual people, try to leap over their suffering in pursuit of inner peace or a sense of what is the right thing to do. The words of forgiveness are said, but the reality of forgiveness has not taken root in their hearts and lives. And so that's another way of like trying to bandage the thorn, but trying to do it in a way that nobody sees it. So maybe we've got a Band-Aid under our sweater and we're like, oh yeah, it's fine. Nobody can see it. Nobody can talk about it. And I'm great. Everything's fine. And he says he cautions that we can do that because at some point it's not going to stay silent. And then things may come up that we are completely unprepared for because we have fooled ourselves into thinking that we've dealt with it and it's fine. So he says, how do you know when you've truly forgiven? How can you gauge that for yourself and know that you haven't just pushed it down somewhere that you can't see it right now? He says, for some people that might feel as if a weight that we've been carrying has lifted. You may have an overwhelming sense of peace about the situation or the person. It might be that you could wish the other person well, or he says, if you can't get there, you at least don't wish them harm. So you get to kind of a neutral place that when someone mentions that person's name, you don't have an internal reaction. You just go, oh, okay. I don't really need to know where they are or what they're doing, but I hope they're okay. And so then that moves on to the fourth step, which is renewing or releasing the relationship. So he says, forgiveness isn't the end of the process, because even when we've forgiven, we have to figure out what do we do now with this relationship. And so he says it's to either renew or release the relationship you have with the one who harmed you. Renewing the relationship involves creating a new path for the relationship where no more debts are owed and the slate has been kind of wiped clean for the moment. And, renewing relationships, he says it's often when we're contemplating renewing a relationship, it's with someone who is close to us. It's with family, it's with friends, it's with a spouse, it's with someone that we, by the nature of just how our social circle works, like we will have some kind of contact with them if we continue in our same circle. And so looking at renewing, like how do we find a path forward? And he says, you're not trying to make a carbon copy of the relationship that came before the hurt. This is like a new way of being. And so like what I heard Brandy say earlier is that you can sometimes create boundaries with someone that are really strong, but still have that relationship, still have a relationship with them. And so to do that, you often have to ask yourself what you need, and if you can ask it of the person who harmed you. So depending on the relationship, it may be that the only way to renew the relationship is that you need them to at least hear your story and hear the hurt that you experienced. You just need to express it. You don't necessarily need them to acknowledge or do anything, but you need it to be heard so that you can release those feelings that are holding the relationship back in the old way. You might need the person to feel remorseful, or at the very least, see that they are taking steps to assure that the same situation won't happen again. And that's kind of the boundaries that Brandy was talking about. Like, can we put something in place that makes me feel confident that if this relationship moves forward in some type of way, that I have less of a chance, less of a risk of feeling like the same situation is going to happen again and I have to move forward. And Desmond says the same thing that Sue, if Sue is ever talking about stuff like this, you can guarantee that she is going to say, we talk about forgiveness and we talk about renewing relationships only if it is safe for you to do so. And we would never suggest that, and he says the same thing. I would never suggest encouraging you to renew a relationship with someone who has hurt you deeply, has no desire to change that relationship in any way, and is at a high risk for harming you again and again if you stay in that relationship. He also says that you may also need an explanation. Like several of the stories in the book, people said, I didn't need them to be sorry. I didn't need them to... What I needed from them was just an explanation of, can you tell me what series of events led up to this event happening? Like from your perspective, what was going on, what created, because they needed that understanding of how did this person and their humanness get to the point of doing this thing that they did. So that may be something. Renewing a relationship may not always be possible. Again, like if you risk further harm. Sometimes you don't know exactly who it was that harmed you, right? Sometimes we have harm that happens and there's really no clear person to point the finger at. It's a systemic issue, or it's something that you just will never know who the exact person was that created or that helped to create that situation. Or the person may no longer be living. And so the other option is releasing the relationship. And he says releasing is refusing to let an experience or person occupy space in your head or heart any longer. So you can choose not to have someone in your life, and that's anyone. I think especially here in the Midwest, we have this idea that blood is thicker than water and family is family and all of that. And he says, you can release a relationship with anyone. If it is not serving you, it's not serving them, you can choose not to have someone in your life, but make sure you're doing it without wishing them hurt or pain. Just knowing that this is not a relationship that serves me, that I am not giving up free rent to someone in my head, and I'm going to release the relationship. Both of those choices allow us to free ourselves from victimhood and trauma. And he says, you become stronger either together or apart. You either renew the relationship and it becomes a better thing than it was before, or you release it and you're stronger and better for releasing it. And he talks a lot about becoming the hero of your own story. So when we flip the script, so to say, and if you can say, I choose to release that relationship because of the harm that it did me, and here are the steps I'm taking to improve myself and have transformation for myself, that's a much stronger place, and it feels better than, I can't be around them because they might hurt me. right? Like we can choose to be the power and be the hero in our own story as we move forward. He then talks about a little bit about forgiving yourself, and that, he says when we're unforgiving of ourselves, we experience the same harmful emotions and physical effects as if when we're unforgiving of others. Because again, we're holding on to pain and shame and guilt and all of those things that our body is trying to deal with because we're not moving through it. And he says forgiving yourself isn't a way to excuse what you've done or gloss over the harm that you've caused others. It's also not about forgetting your own actions. It's not a platitude that you just go, oh, I forgive myself for all the things that I've done. The end of story, and we're moving on. He says you have to go through the same fourfold path. Kind of, you have to acknowledge the story. You have to name the hurt. And then instead of granting forgiveness, you're asking for forgiveness. And so we have to have an honest remembering of what we've done, how we've hurt others, because we can't just use self-forgiveness as a loophole to avoid admitting our wrongs or making restitution. And so he talks about when we're forgiving ourselves, like I said, we have to get true about the story of what we perceive we have done to harm someone else. We have to acknowledge our feelings within that and acknowledge that they may have different feelings about how that happened. And then, like I said, instead of granting, we're asking for that forgiveness. So when possible and when safe to do so, like actually going to that person and kind of making amends, saying, I'm acknowledging that in this situation, I caused some pain and hurt for you. And here's what I've dealt with, here's where I'm at with it, or here's maybe even explaining in that moment, here's what I was feeling or thinking, and I didn't intend to cause harm, or here's what I think I could do to move this relationship forward. And then we have to be okay with however they respond to that. Yeah, John.
One of the things when you were talking about that, I was aware too of a situation in my life where the memories of the events were very different between the two people. And so that part of the reconciliation process was being open to that the experience was totally different for the other person. And they saw and felt and remember totally different things than what you did. And that's a kind of a weird experience too.
It is, and isn't it interesting that you don't have to agree on the facts to validate each other's feelings about the situation. And sometimes the person that you're asking forgiveness from, they feel the same way. It's not so much about the facts of what happened as how it made them feel as it was happening. And they just need some acknowledgement or affirmation and validation that they're allowed to feel their feelings too. And where I've seen people get really stuck in that unforgiveness is when there does become a battle over the facts. Like, I need you to agree that this happened in this order, and it's just not going to happen because we experienced it differently and we remember it differently, and so there may not be. We may never get to a common listing of the facts. It makes me think of the meme that I've seen on Facebook, or a little cartoon where there's two people standing on either side of a number, and one person is saying it's a 6 and the other person is saying it's a 9, and they're just arguing back and forth. But from their perspective, it is a 6, and for the other's perspective, it is a 9. So they're never going to agree on what that number is unless they swap places. And so that makes me think of this idea here in forgiveness too, is that we're standing on either sides of the same thing, and it may actually look very different, depending on the experience and the perspective you were experiencing it from. He talks about that self-forgiveness is true acceptance. self-acceptance of our humanness and our willingness to explore our feelings of guilt, shame, or grief associated with our own actions, and that we have to be accountable for our actions, but again, not stay stuck in an unhappy story of what we've done and make an identity of the past actions. So we don't get to call ourselves monsters or evil or whatever other, disrespectful or whatever other adjective you can throw on there. Because if we label ourselves as that, then we're just stuck in that pattern of being as well. And he says when we do that, we deny ourselves the beautiful gift of transformation. And so what we've talked a lot about here at Unity is that, we sing the peace song, peace begins with me. And so forgiveness begins with you as well. You have to be able to forgive yourself and recognize your own humanness before you can then see that in others and allow that process for them. And so I'll just give some parting words here on forgiveness and changing our world. He says, it seems there is no end to the creative way that we humans can find to hurt each other, and no end to the reasons that we feel justified in doing so. There is also no end to the human capacity for healing. In each of us, there's an innate ability to create joy out of suffering, to find hope in the most hopeless of situations, and to heal any relationship in need of healing. There are two simple truths. There is nothing that cannot be forgiven, and there is no one undeserving of forgiveness. The quality of human life on our planet is nothing more than the sum total of our daily interactions with one another. Each time we help and each time we harm, we are having a dramatic impact on our world. Forgiveness is the way that we can set those interactions right. It is the way that we mend tears in the social fabric, and it's the way we stop our human community from unraveling. And I think, given some circumstances that we know about that are happening this week, it seemed very timely as I was going through this material to keep these things in mind, that when we're feeling powerless, to remember that our true power lies within, and as we change ourselves, so do we change our world and those around us, and it ripples out and out. And if we can acknowledge our humanness and acknowledge the fact that, like he says, everything can be forgiven and there is no one that is unforgivable, we can look at things through that lens and hopefully get to a path of forgiveness a little faster and a little faster as we move through life. And that just seemed like a really beautiful message to end on today. So, thank you. Oh, just in announcements. So, if the weather would just cooperate, mat making will continue on Thursdays from 12:30 to 2:30. Let Brandy know if you want to volunteer on a Saturday as a second date and time. A second date and time is in the talks. Please continue to bring in bags, especially those that are colorful. Our mat weavers like to make designs and they look amazing. New volunteers are always welcome, and there will be training and the supplies are there, so just come. Thursdays at 6:30 is the Calling Your Divine Support System group led by James Masters. They are using the book Ask Your Guides by Sonia Coquette. Next week's New Thought and World Religion class will be taught by Mr. John Brocker, standing in the back there for those of you who are here, doing self-healing with breath work based on a book by Jack Angelo. That is sure to be amazing. And mark your calendars for the YOU Pancake Breakfast on March 20th. They are raising money to go to Rally and for other things they need. So that morning we will not be having a formal adult ed class because we're going to eat pancakes and have fellowship. So more to come on pricing and what you'll get when you join for that. And we hope you join us at 11 o'clock. Namaste.